This is the third lecture in the series for human rights. Uh, we're now going to focus on what is the main article that we're going to be exploring, and much of the midterm focuses on. The other articles are important, but they kind of support or lead into the Levin Institute's project on globalization from SUNY. So I'm going to back up a little bit so we can talk about Locke and kind of put things back into perspective there, and then talk about, move forward and talk about how we really use the concepts and the ideas, bring those all together. I would like to say that globalization, just as a way of sort of setting the stage, when you take the idea, the concept of human rights, you really can't make it nation bound for two reasons. One, it's limited in scope and therefore not as informative because it doesn't necessarily speak to the issue across cultures and so on and so forth. The second thing is, you'll see, there has to be a universality to it. The idea that it is only applicable in some structures we talked about last time it makes it inconsequential. You need to be able to say that these things are universal. So that's the fundamental idea. So globalization is the best context to put this in, although globalization has many faces or facets to it. We're really interested in looking at human rights in that context of globalization, keeping in mind that you cannot separate the interaction between states, politically and economically, culturally and otherwise, as everyone tries to influence what goes on in other nations. I think it's oversimplification to say, well, if we just, if there's globalization and people have access to markets and the like, everything gets better. I think in some ways that's a uniquely Western or certainly American, viewpoint, that somehow if the economics are right, everything else is right. And that's really not the way it works. These things, economics, politics, and their impact on human rights, they are opposite sides, I've said before, of the same coin. You can't separate one from the other and really have an understanding, an in-depth understanding of what human rights means across the board. Keep in mind that nations as individual sovereign entities, right? They're out there advocating for their own interests, just like individuals are doing that with their own interests. So we've got a mountain to climb in trying to get everyone sort of in the same space in terms of how we view it and how we act in accordance with human rights. The key here, I think, is to, in a way, look at the UN, not because the UN has got an incredibly, wonderful record in terms of engaging this globalization and human rights, but because that's the one place where nations meet, where you can see the interaction and you can kind of get a better sense of what people sign on to, whether or not it gets executed, whether or not it's interpreted the same in every venue, every nation, is another issue. This is hard work, a serious and very difficult endeavor because of the self-serving interest of individuals, states, leaders, political institutions, economic institutions, and their many manifestations, corporations, individuals, everyone vying for their own self-interest, makes it very difficult to come up with any sort of system that one would say would work across the board, because it gets corrupted. So the corruptible nature of human beings and fear, as I've said before, really drive this process. It's almost as if we could get rid of human fear and uncertainty. This would be a lot easier. Unlimited resources, access to those resources, whatever they may be, a full respect for human beings. Maybe that would get us there. That is a long, arduous road for the reasons I've mentioned. Nevertheless, we can't get there unless we think about it in terms of what the steps are. So the first step really is getting our minds around, and we've been doing it up to this point, how we define and what is human rights. We key it to natural rights and so on and so forth. Because if we can't define it, if we can't understand it, and this is a peculiarly, I think, academic endeavor. Scholars tend to really want to understand the nitty-gritty of things and don't always necessarily focus on the implementation of it or where the rubber meets the road sort of thing, because that's a lot more difficult to quantify and qualify. But the definitions and how things should work and what the consequences are in places where things work a certain way, where human rights are enforced in a certain way, those we can learn from. So as with all intellectual pursuits, especially about those that really impact people, people are complicated. So the issues we deal with in the social sciences are very complicated. As I've said before, the nice thing about the hard sciences is that you've got the scientific method. You throw a ball up in the air and it falls down. You do the experiment a couple of times. You say, hey, we've got gravity. I know it's an incredible oversimplification. So for those science majors out there taking this class, my sincere apologies. Nevertheless, it's a much more exacting way to approach things, right? The hard sciences. The social sciences are sloppy. They're dealing with human nature and human interaction, and a whole host of manifestations of human endeavor, whether it's in writing or the arts or whatever the culture may be, and whatever the engagement in that culture from various sectors might be. So, for example, music, very different from culture to culture, or certainly can be. Nevertheless, usually that represents the culture in some way, right? I think one of the greatest export America has is our culture. Hollywood does great business. The music industry, does great business. Around the world, when you think about how much music Americans are familiar with, other than music that kind of comes from the West, or whatever culture they originally came from, their families, whether it's second or third generation, that children have been exposed to, they might hold on to that, and they kind of bring that to America. But it has to get a broad base. But nevertheless, it has to be culturally significant. Look up Cakewalk. Just check up Cakewalk as an art form, and it gives you a reasonable sense of how you have to integrate those arts into the culture. Those arts represent, right, the social structure and norms. And so there again, the social sciences, understanding the arts, which, so you go beyond the social sciences to the arts. The arts are even more, I think, difficult to get one's mind around. I think the level of difficulty, or the level of the way in which we endeavor to deal with issues is, science is the easy part. Now, I'm not saying that, science can move quickly or has all the answers, or that it's not an arduous process in and of itself, but it is rigorous. It has fundamental principles that it works off of, and they work. And if they don't work, they can change them. Scientists tend to be more tied to, inputs and outputs. This is what causes that in most cases. As Einstein said, all I need, or all we need, is someone to come along and demonstrate one exception to my theory, and my theory falls. And you would have been happy about that. It's like, great, we just took a step forward. So that's sort of the straightforward approach. It's difficult. I'm not saying it's not. You don't land someone on the moon and say that's easy, or endeavor to understand whether time really exists. I'm not saying that. But those principles and the fundamentals they can build on to get to very complex ideas is really more straightforward. At least it has some component parts you can get your mind around. I think the next level of endeavor really is craft. And that's what really the social sciences are. It's taking component parts, putting them together, and doing something interesting with them that outpops some sort of elucidating, idea element, and we kind of try and see how that fits into the puzzle. And then of course the puzzle's moving; it keeps changing because cultures change and all. So we're trying to always get nothing. We can get no more than a snapshot of a moving picture in the social sciences. The thing there is that things are constantly changing. We don't get to a principle and it's immutable. It changes. Things get turned on their ear. Currently now in 2020, you look at freedom of expression and what's going on around, in the United States, is really challenging what that means, or if it means anything. So the next highest level of engagement, the arts, because the arts take things that don't necessarily have any principles to them. I mean, in music, yes, there's a scale, there's all that, but and they do something interesting with it. So the highest form of endeavor is art. Now, you can be an artist in the sciences. You can be an artist, in the hard sciences, in the social sciences, and in the arts. I mean, or you can be pretty mundane in any one of those three. I mean, you can be in the hard sciences, and nothing. You come up with nothing spectacular. I mean, genius is taking things that no one saw, bringing them together, and saying, "Look," and people then look at it and go, "Wow." So time doesn't really exist. Now it's a mind blower. It's sort of for an oversimplification. While the world sort of looks at this, the genius comes along, looks at the elements, goes, no, it's that, and everyone goes, oh, right? The wheel, fire. It's like interesting, right? Revolutionizes the way we think because it's a new element that changes the face of everything. So if you can be in the social sciences and be an artist, highest form of endeavor, you're taking things that no one, elements that everyone knows, let's say, and putting them together in ways that no one's thought about. That's incredibly valuable. Same thing in the social sciences, you can be an artist. And even in the arts, you can be a pedestrian, you write something or whatever, it's sort of the same stuff. Or you can do something that's not been done before, or do things in a way that no one's thought about. You see a lot of that in music. Music becomes very sort of locked down, formulaic, and really uninteresting. And every once in a while, along comes an artist, in one of the forms. Doesn't have to be in any one particular form. It could be jazz, it could be pop, it could be classical, whatever it is, and they do something different. And people look at that, or hear it in that case, and they think that's interesting, right? Being able to take those elements and do that with it, who would have thought of that? That's what's so fascinating about it. So we should all strive to be artists in whatever we do. That's something that we can apply also to the study of human rights. Take the information, take what we can from the social sciences and the economics of it and the like, political structures, and rearrange them, move them around, and say, okay, why doesn't this concept work there? What is it about maybe that environment, that political structure, the economic structure, the culture that exists there that makes this really difficult, right? Makes this really difficult. Human rights, even in America, right, was not always as expansive as it is today. It's got a long way to go. So these things transform, they change. It's why in Supreme Court decisions, for example, there will be changes. There's new precedent set. They become aware that the way we thought about this before doesn't make any sense, and therefore, given the same facts, we need to change the outcome, the decision. All right, so let's look at John Locke, because for the gateway here is America, because I'm assuming most people have some understanding of that because they are either born here and live here, or are here, immigrants and that sort of thing, or new citizens, or what have you, that basically it's a good place to sort of assume that I can build an understanding, because most people in the United States, taking a class in the United States on human rights, would probably have some understanding of how the United States system works. So we look at John Locke again, his second treatise on government, which goes all the way back to 1690. Now, when you think about that, that was quite some time ago, right? Do the math. It holds up today. That's a difficult thing in the social science, come up with a concept that actually holds up over an incredibly long period of time. So in the second treatise on government, he described what he called the state of nature. That we talked about this, right? Before there was society, before there was government, before any of it, individuals fended for themselves in the state of nature. So that's the beginning of everything in terms of how we think of human rights. At its core, those rights have to be tied to natural rights. Rights you don't need some culture, society, group to give you. You have them, and they are about self-perpetuation, as we've talked about. So governments that establish laws have only the right to enforce those laws that are consistent with the natural rights, not necessarily the rights themselves. So Locke's philosophy is really it's known as classical liberalism, and it really helped bring in a new way of thinking about. There you go again with sort of turning the thing around, thinking about human rights and the way we approach them. So you get the founding fathers in the United States. The founders adopted this. We've talked about this already. The Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson wrote it, and he was supposed to have others help him along, including Ben Franklin. But Ben Franklin was busy and said, Tommy, go off and write this thing. I'm not sure that's exactly the way he put it, but that was the idea. And so Jefferson basically looked at was very familiar with the major thinkers at the time and said, well, Locke's got this right. And he didn't, as I said before, want to plagiarize it. So life, liberty, and property became life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A rather weak, replacement for property. Nevertheless, that's what we all came to understand it to actually mean. So in order to serve those rights, governments had to have, institutions that they set up. And those institutions would have to derive their power, their authority, from the consent of the governed. Because if all the governed were in a natural state and had rights, they would have to be willing, in a structural way, give those rights or grant those rights or some of those rights, not abdicate them, but grant them to that representative form of government. Right? That's what they'd have to do. So the power of the government came from the people. Now just take a step back. If you look in America and you look at the two major parties, I think one of the ways that most people sort of differentiate them, or used to differentiate them, because that also changes, is that, the Democrats believe in more of an expansive involvement of government in people's lives. The Republicans believe there should be less of an involvement in people's lives. That's a broad oversimplification, but it helps me make the point, which is either of those two, to their extreme, violate or create problems with this idea of natural law. So as a consequence of this, we can see that the Democrats or the Republicans moving in extreme directions, where government controls everything, let's say, or where government controls nothing, eventually will corrode and corrupt human rights. Because in the one instance, where the government controls everything, you're giving them the authority to do all of that, and that means that they can, impact, bleed into, and have some sort of entry into every single part of your life. The other extreme, where the government just says we're not doing anything, brings about chaos and disorder. So it's always striking that balance. In some areas, we want more government control, and in others, we want less government control if we're talking about maximizing human rights. The devil's in the details, right? Where are those lines? And those lines move. Depending upon the moment in time, the culture, the lines move. We need more government involvement. We need less government involvement. So that means an awareness based, that the people must have, right? Because they're giving this authority over to those that govern. So, you'll hear me say this again. We have responsibility as citizens, right? We need to be reasonably sophisticated consumers of information, political information, public policy. You can, but it's dangerous to cede all of that power to your power to a governing body without understanding its implications, right? So unfortunately, people have to live lives, and they can't spend time, reading and catching up on the intricacies of policy. That's what the representatives are supposed to do. But relying on them to make a policy clear to you means that you're giving them room to interpret information for you that doesn't necessarily have to be accurate. You can get everyone that signs on to a bill. You can have unanimous agreement. Everyone in Congress, every member of the House and the Senate all sign on to a bill. President passes it. President does not veto it. You've got 100% agreement. Now when it gets implemented, how is it being implemented? Is it consistent with what all those people thought? They probably signed on not thinking the same things. In other words, not believing exactly and moving in lockstep. So even there, even 100% agreement, you've got disagreement. It's just not bubbling to the top yet. Or if it is, they've suppressed that or they see it as insignificant. The point here is this. When you give up your natural rights to a governing structure through even representative government, you have to understand that that's corruptible. Regardless of, the name you put on it, Democrat, Republican, Independent, Socialist, it doesn't matter. Human beings are corruptible, their institutions are corruptible, and those that give them power have responsibility to understand what they're doing and see how it impacts them so they can make wise decisions. But people either are not interested in doing it, don't have the capacity to fully understand the intricacies of it, are trusting of their representatives to do the right thing, right? Or there's a whole bunch of cognitive dissonance going on, and that creates even more difficulty in the face of facts. If there's cognitive dissonance, people will put that aside. So let me just explain that for a second, because I think it's very important understanding the engagement of people in the political process. Fundamentally, we believe something. We believe that someone is a good parent. Okay. However we define that. I'm not going to define it, but however we define it. And let's say, to use an absurd example, so you don't get distracted by the example, but the idea is hopefully will still be there. Let's say that a good parent always gives their kids lots of chocolate. Okay. So who doesn't like chocolate? Well, there are people that don't. Nothing's absolute. But let's say everybody does. And so parents give a lot of chocolate to kids. And then there's some scientific research, and it turns out that chocolate can cause cavities, which are a bad thing, right? Painful and the like. But if you are a producer of chocolate, and if you are a major consumer of chocolate, the fact that you've been consuming something or producing something that is harmful could give rise to some dissonance. It's uncomfortable. I don't like the fact that what I thought now is not correct. It's hard for people to change and say, I've been wrong. Difficult expression, I was wrong. And be okay with and happy with the fact that I was wrong. Now I know what we've got to do. Let's do it, and we'll be in a better place. People lock down because they don't like the distance. They say, no, that's a bad study. Or you know what? There are many, many, many more upsides to chocolate. Those that are doing it as a business, making a lot of money, they'll pay for advertisement to talk about the wonders of chocolate. I mean, we did it, right, with cigarettes, right? They're supposed to be good for you. Originally, they're supposed to be good for you. Coca-Cola, people loved it. Got to get rid of the cocaine that's in there, and they moved to get rid of that. So when there's cognitive dissonance, people are very uncomfortable and they don't want to see it. Now, put it on a personal level. If you love someone, and you believe they love you, but it looks like they don't, people easily distort that. No one likes that kind of dissonance. So it's, you try and explain it away. But it's clear to everybody else, right? We look for cognitive consistency. We want the world to be what we think it is. It makes us feel okay. It makes us feel safe. That's why we have institutions. America is a place, rule of law. That's why we create all this. In some, structures. In some ways, structures are a way of the collective saying, this is how we want the world to be. Okay, and then we sort of stick with it. That makes everything that much more difficult, right? Makes that everything much more difficult. So this idea of dissonance, comes into play. So if you have backed a political party or a particular policy or a certain sector of business, and you believe, because it also creates an information shortcut, right? You don't have to know a lot. It's like, okay, you tell me what's going on. I believe you. We're all good. No cognitive dissonance. Everything looks right. And if I get a lot of other people to agree with me, I'm ready to go to the mat for it. And if you question it, within the people that support it, it becomes unsettling, dissonance. And that's not good. So we strive for that because it feels okay. And we need it to feel okay, because if it's not okay, well, unfortunately, we suffer. So back to public policy. It's easy to abdicate our responsibility for being informed citizen of political information for the reasons I mentioned. There's no interest, which is unfortunate. There's no understanding of the complexities. Not everyone has the same capacities. Some people understand, trigonometry. Others just look at it and see nothing, right? That's understandable. We all don't have the same brain structures. We all don't like the same things. But with public policy, it affects everyone. So there's a need to sort of at least engage in some way. And so those information shortcuts, the folks that are supposed to know, telling us what it means, we believe in them. In America, we like the fact that, it's supposed to be elections that are actually our revolution, right? But elections take 2 years or 4 years or 6 years, depending upon, whether it's on the national level, the House, the Senate, or the presidency. So if someone's making a mistake, they've got 2 years, 4 years, 6 years to keep that going. And so it's not as immediate as one would like, but it's certainly not as destructive as revolution. Everyone likes the idea of revolution. It's kind of, wow, revolution. But look at the revolutions, Chinese Revolution, Cuban Revolution, on and on. They don't end well. They drive us off, the movement forward. They usually end up in dictatorial rule. And it takes a long time, 50, 60 years, typically, to sort of work through that. That's an individual's entire life, right? Adult life anyway. All right. Getting back to just sort of the, looking at Lockean, the Lockean approach here in the context of what I've just said, the Declaration of Independence, right, talks about those natural rights. So here we have it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now that's about as concise an explanation of what the foundation is of governance to human beings, and ultimately to human rights, or those unalienable rights. Pretty compact. Now, we don't want to get hung up because it's not productive in terms of understanding it. That all men are created equal. We're going to keep gender out of this only because that's not going to help us get the concepts down. Gender has to be part of it, right? It has to be, as do other demographics and things by which we define one another. But for now, because those things will come back in, it's just helpful to not engage that conversation this early on. We don't have the tools yet to really look at it in interesting and, I think, more sophisticated and important ways. So we'll push that aside, right? The key here is that to secure these rights, right, governments are instituted among men. We form governments to secure the rights, not take them from us, right? We share some rights, we give them some rights because it helps, in the long run, the greater good. Deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. To secure these rights, governments are instituted or created among men, deriving their just powers, the government, from the consent of the governed. The people give the power to the institutions whose job it is to basically secure these rights, the fundamental rights and the rights that flow from those. So when you look at natural theorists like Hobbes, the idea of self-preservation, that's the foundation. That's the beginning of it. If a right is not about self-preservation in some way, and that can get very cloudy. What is self-preserving? What isn't? We'll put that aside for now. That the idea that self-preservation is at the core of this, and the right to property, which was Locke. Right? Hobbes was self-preservation, Locke was the right to property. Those things are tied together. When we say property, we mean the right to possess things. You work very hard to put crops in the field. You have a right to reap the benefit, of those crops. Someone shouldn't be allowed to come in and say, "Oh, look, all these crops are here. I'm taking all of this." So there is this sense that you should benefit from your own labor, right? And that goes all kinds of places. One of the difficult things about exploring human rights is that because it's so essential and it's so important and it's found to have so many things, it's very easy to go off in any one direction. We're going to try and keep that moving in a direction that's going to be hopefully most enlightening. Okay, so the validity of fundamental rights, right, are self-evident. That's what we hold. Self-preservation. Do we really need to discuss whether or not we should have a right to self-preserve? Is anyone confused about that? Does anyone say, why? I don't think I should have the right to self-preserve. I think you should take care of yourself, but I shouldn't take care of me. It's fundamental and it's universal, and you'll see how those two things are so important as guideposts. All right. There's not been a lot of debate over these ideas, right? Self-preservation, and the right to property. It's sort of something that's accepted. We don't think about it anymore. In law, it's, we talk about black letter law. It's well settled. There's no need to have this argument again. There's no need to debate this again, right? The debate's over. We've all agreed. It makes sense. It's so incredibly and clearly logical that there's no need to discuss it, right? So here's a key part of this. If you think about a right and how human rights are distinct from natural rights, how do you get there? Well, a right, is a justifiable claim. Oxford English Dictionary defines it this way: on legal or moral grounds, to have or obtain something. Now, think about that and take that in, right? And I think it's a very good way to look at it. It's a justifiable claim. How do we define what's justifiable or not? Well, justifiable. That means the structure of the law, the rule of law, the way we interpret the law, all of that has got to be able to support the claim. You bring a claim, we should be able to logically and rationally look at that and say, you have a right to bring that claim. And that it's a justifiable claim on legal or moral grounds, right? Legal grounds are easier because typically, when you think about legal structures, they're laid out. Declaration of Independence, in statutes, in regulations. They're laid out, so we know what they are. They're open to interpretation, but we know what they are. Okay. Moral grounds, we talked about morality before and how that's sort of also a fundamental block upon which all of this is built. If you want something or you want to act in a certain way, it has to be justifiable. You have to claim that you have a right to do that either on legal or moral grounds. That means natural law, natural rights are the beginning of this, right? Self-preservation as a sort of category, right? Self-preservation and property. Okay, now, based on that, what can we build? What can we build? And can we claim it as either being supported, that claim being supported either in law, some legal structure, or on some accepted moral grounds? if you look at cases before the courts, especially the Supreme Court, they struggle with defining these things because how they define them will, in large measure, determine how they decide them. And what they try and do is do it on legal, for the most part, consistently legal, that's why there's precedent, grounds, or even on moral grounds. Some things are just accepted because we as a culture have come to accept them, and hopefully they're good. And if not good, hopefully we address that and we correct it. Okay, so here we go. Here is the classic definition of human rights. Remember, it's got to be universal. It's not culturally specific, because if it is, then it's because human beings are everywhere. And if you say that one culture or one place, one system defines it, that's highly unlikely. So we look for that universality, right? So this is from author named Cranston, goes back to 1973. A human right. If you want to read that, it's in the actual study, and it's in the footnotes, bibliography, all that. Human rights, by definition, is a universal moral right. That means it's a universal morality, and that universal morality should be tied to this idea of self-preservation and property. Now, let me just make a quick aside. Do not get thrown off course by the word property. It means the right to possess something, right? It doesn't have to be physical property, right? The right to have ownership over something, either permanently or some period of time. A lot of law addresses that. Think about patent law. You have a right to things that you've created. And so property is part of that. So please don't think of property as people that have and those that don't have. That certainly is one way we look at the inequality, but it's a general category of things, right? A general category of things. So a human right, by definition, a universal moral right, something which all men, again, we're not getting hung up on that, we're not going to address it just yet, everywhere, at all times ought to have, something of which no one may be deprived without a grave affront to justice, something which is owing to every human being. Very concise. Universal, moral right, to everyone, everywhere, regardless of structure of government or what have you. And that any action that's an affront to it is an affront to justice, and it's a violation. It's not specific, but yeah, we get a little bit more into the specifics of this now. All right. Wasserstrom, back in 1979. Again, as you read this article, which is really, really important, you'll be able to look at the footnotes and go back and look at the original source if you'd like. So I'm going to read you the parts that I think are, that are in this article that I want to talk about and expand on. So it turns out there are, according to this, 4 necessary requirements for human rights. The first, it must be possessed by all human beings, universality, right? As well as only human beings. Interesting, right? It must be possessed by all human beings as well as only by human beings. We don't think, and it sounds odd, we don't think of these rights as really applying to any other group or thing. Again, this is messy stuff. There are rights, animal rights. I'm kind of going off on a bit of a tangent, but animal rights and the like. And again, I don't mean to give short shrift to anything, but we would not be able to move forward. This is the social sciences. We have to kind of accept certain things and not explore others in order to move forward in a certain way. And someone that says, well, you can't. You've got to explore everything. It's one of the great faults, I think, of the educational system until you get to graduate school, where you think you have to write about everything. You have to give an answer to everything. Someone asks a question in a class as an exam question, or asks you to write a paper, and you explode all over the place. And somehow it seems an affront to an intellectual endeavor for students that you want us just to concentrate on this one part of this one thing, which is part of these other 30 things. That's what you want. It's like, yes, narrow, specific, a building block for others. So I think that's hard for people to sort of get their minds around, students, that it's narrow, it's specific. You explore something in a very specific way, in a very narrow way. So not going off on the rights of other living things is a, I hate to refer to it as a tangent. It almost seems like I'm giving it, I'm discarding these things. I'm not. I'm simply saying that we can't do it. We have to stay focused to move through this and build an understanding. By the time the course is over, hopefully you'll have a great understanding, an expansive understanding, and see the intricacies of the parts. But it's just the beginning of your understanding all this. It's just beginning of what would be a very long exploration of the ideas in order to get a greater clarity. So we have to be in this in this structure focused on specifics. Okay. So that's the first. Second, so universality and only of human beings. Second, because it is the same right that all human beings possess, right? It must be possessed equally by all humans. That's the second thing, right? This is the second requirement. That first was that it has to be universal, all human beings, and the second is that everyone has to possess it. It must be considered a right, and everyone has it, right? Equally by all human beings. No one excluded. No one. Every human being of every stripe, regardless of any way in which we might define them, every human being. Third, because human rights are possessed by all human beings, we can rule out as possible candidates any of those rights which one might have in virtue of occupying any particular status or relationship. That's a lot of verbiage. Because the rights are possessed by all human beings, we can rule out a possible candidates, right, as possible candidates, any of those rights which one might have in virtue of occupying any particular status or relationship. Since these are held by everyone, they're not granted either exclusively or in greater quantity or greater depth to any one person, regardless of the position they hold. Being a rich person or a poor person doesn't change this. Being an elected official or not doesn't change this. Nothing changes it. It's immutable. No one can gain more rights as a human being than another human being. It's not possible. Okay? Now we know that's not the way the real world works, and it's unfortunate, but this is the place we want to get to, even though that's a very long evolutionary endeavor for human beings. I think it's one of the great challenges for us. We live our 70, 80, 90 years, whatever it is, and our culture and our moment in time and all of that sort of narrows our view. And we view everything, with these blinders on, cultural blinders and the like. And we want everything to happen during our lifetime, right? We're impatient. In part because we want affirmation that these things are good and everyone should want them, whatever that might be. And the idea is, hopefully through education and endeavor, we could just open those a little bit. I don't think we can get rid of them a little bit. So maybe we can see a little bit further down the road and not distort things so much. So we tend to evaluate things in terms of our own lifespans. It's like we've got these 90 years and everything we've seen is, all there really is. We've defined it, and that's not the case at all. Things change, sometimes incredibly, incredibly dramatically. And that is always a bit odd. Okay, so that's the third thing. And the fourth is, if there are any human rights, they have the additional characteristic of being assertable in a manner speaking against the whole world. Okay, so think about the key here, right? It's got to be universal. That's the first thing, right? Everyone has to possess it, right, equally. Third, you can't get more of it because of position or where you are. You've got it. And the fourth is that, it's got to be assertable. That's the whole idea about a claim. If you can't assert the right, there is no right. The point of having a right is you can assert it, right? In that moral or legal structure. So those are the necessary requirements if you look at, defining human rights. This is an interesting approach, and it's a valuable one. So it's got to be universal. That's the first thing. The second thing is that everyone's got to possess it equally. The third thing is that it doesn't change based upon position of any kind, right? And the last thing is that it's got to be assertable. Those things are key. If it's missing any one of those elements, we really can't say that it is a proper definition or an example of a human right. It's got to be universal. Everyone's got it. Can't increase it because of position or what have you, and you got to be able to assert the right. That's why the rule of law is so important, because the rule of law allows you, right, to, in a structure, assert the right. Okay, so again, we like to look at the United Nations because you've got all these different cultures, societies, coming together and trying to agree on human rights, right? There is a United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So it's something that we are all focused on and we all acknowledge exists. It's in what form and so on. And here's how they basically define it. Quote, rights inherent to all human beings, whatever our nationality, place of residence, sex, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, language, or any other status. We are equally entitled to our human rights without discrimination. You can take that and pull out of it and pretty much get those four elements. They don't talk about it directly, but this idea of being entitled to it means that it's got to be assertable. You have a right, it's got to be assertable. So the primary element recurring throughout each of these definitions, again, is universality. All people have it by just being human being. Those are the core. Those two are the core. So let's just step back for a second and look at our situation. We have a unique relationship, you and I. You have paid for a service. That's what you've done. You've paid tuition. You've borrowed money in some cases in order to get the education. And for people like me and my colleagues, you pay to come into a class and hopefully learn, right, about stuff, right? Whether it's in the hard sciences, the arts, or social science, it doesn't matter. You've paid for a service of some kind. You have a right to it, property right to it. I paid for it. I own this right. And we have an odd relationship because in most instances where you have a right to something, that you've purchased, a property right to it, it does have a positive consequence. That's why you've done it, right? You're getting some value out of it. But the weirdness here is that part of it having value is that I'm entrusted in limiting that value to you. In other words, you could take a class and fail it. You've paid for to receive something, and what you've received is something negative. Now, we'd like to say that's within your power, but let's just say I am a horribly corrupt individual, and I just don't like you because you didn't say good morning to me every morning as you walked into class, and I decided I was going to fail you. Now, there are things in place where you can check that, right? You can appeal the grade and so on. But the point is it's a strange relationship. But think about it. You have to, in order to have what you've earned, the grade, be of any value, you need someone to discern that that grade is appropriate. So you're paying for something. In essence, you're my boss, right? You've paid for my services through the college. But I can hurt you with the grade. But in order to have the grade be worth something, should you get a good grade, that has to be on the table. That I can differentiate between those that should get an A+ and those that should fail the class. Now, I'm not perfect, so I could miss that mark, right? What's the difference between, an A minus and an A? It's a few points, but how do you get to those few points? Is that essay really worth one more point? And if it is, that would have moved you to the higher grade, right? So there are judgments calls even in that, but that's the relationship. So you have a right to something, but it doesn't mean that it's an unqualified right. And sometimes, giving up what seems to be a natural, sort of outcome, right? Giving up a sort of return on your investment in order to make your investment more valuable is a worthwhile endeavor. Now, that is a very small and insignificant example of the complexity of a right, right? A right can't be taken from you. We can't diminish it. It's universal. You have an assertable right, even in the context I just gave you with appealing the grade and so on and so forth. So, it gets complicated, but fundamentally, these things stay in place, no matter how complicated it gets. As soon as you take away universality, then you've got a problem, right? Because then it's not a human right, which means all humans have. It's been well settled, right? Or if you can't assert it, right? Or someone can get more of it somehow than you. These are problematic. Okay, now we move a little further down the pike here. Again, you'll see the universal theme comes up over and over and over again. If you look at this a little bit further, what you'll see is that when we look at these things, there are three overarching types of human rights norms. Okay, these are places where those norms would sit. The first is civil political. We're going to explore each of these. The next is socioeconomic, and then third is the collective developmental. We're taking this on face value. So those first two, civil, political, and socioeconomic, that's the potential claims that individuals have against the state and that are accepted. The relationship between the civil and the political, socio, and the economic, that these things are really directions at the state, the power you've given them and how they've structured things and so on. So those are the first two. The other type is a potential claim of people and groups against the state, is the most debated and lacks both the legal and political recognition, right? Each of these types includes two further subtypes. So think about this. You have these three types, right? This civil political, right? This social and economic, and this collective developmental. It's that last one that, needs a little bit of tweaking. So let's just look at the civil political human rights. That has two subtypes. And these are norms that pertain to physical and civil security. Now stop. When we think of civil rights, based on human rights, this is what we think of, right? We talk about physical and civil security. Physical security is as fundamental a right as you can get, self-preservation, right? And so structures have to be in place that guarantee at least a process for protecting those, right? Rule of law, your day in court, a consistency in the law, right? You can't go changing laws and what they mean and how they're interpreted willy-nilly, because then no one knows what the laws are, no one knows how to govern their behavior, so they can avoid running afoul of the law. If the meaning changes, willy-nilly, very scientific term, changes, right? No one knows what it is. And if no one knows what it is, they're vulnerable to violating it and then being punished for violating a rule they didn't know existed. That's why, for example, in the American system, as with other systems, you can't write an ex post facto law. You can't write a law today that makes, say, something punishable by a year in prison. But yesterday it didn't. That law didn't exist. You can't go back now and say, we're going to apply this new law to what that person did 3 days ago. That person is not responsible for violating that law because it didn't exist. If you could write ex post facto laws, you could punish people willy-nilly. You could say, I don't like that person, what they did. We're going to write a law, and when we go back, we're going to get them. There's an inconsistency then. Then there is no rule of law. You can't have ex post facto laws. That's why there's a legal process. That's why when the courts, the Supreme Court especially, is interpreting something and changing it, it doesn't go back. It's from that moment forward. Right now, just as a quick aside, what does this mean for someone that was convicted under a law that existed? Let's say, marijuana is illegal. And let's just say, it was under zero tolerance. So this person got caught with a very small amount and now is in prison for life. Then, fast forward 10 years or whatever, and it's no longer a crime. Punishable by anything, maybe a small fine. What do we do? That person broke a law when it existed way back when. That law no longer exists. So if that person had done that same act today, they would not be punished. What do we do? Do we go back and say, all you folks that now can go? We can't give them back the time they lost. We can't give them back, days, hours, months, years of their life. So that's a double-edged sword, right? What do you do with that? That's a decision that we have to make, and we make it based on this idea of the political, civil political human rights. So, torture, slavery, inhumane treatment, arbitrary arrest, equality before the law. These are all things with the interaction between civil behavior and political structures, right? The rule of law. You got to keep the courts open. When we don't enforce the law, we start losing the fundamentals of our society. And then we start violating people's human rights. And when you violate one person's human rights and no one does anything about that in the civil political structures, you're eroding everyone's rights. It's important that we always remember that in all contexts, right? So the norms pertaining to civil political liberties are basically empowerments, freedom of thought, conscience, religion. Think Bill of Rights, especially the first. In the Bill of Rights, but also others. I mean, if you look at the 10 of them, it deals with civil liberties and civil rights, right? So you're looking at who gets arrested. What's the legal process? You go to law school, there's a class on criminal procedure, and criminal law. Everyone gets the same process. If the process is not consistent, then the means by which you take away someone's rights tied to their human rights, like freedom, change. And you can't have them change. Not like that. They need to be consistent. And that's the court's job, to look at those and make sure those procedures have been consistent, right? Due process. Everyone gets that, right? And the like. The next is socioeconomic, and there's two subtypes here. Norms pertain to provisions of goods, right, meaning social needs, nutrition, shelter, healthcare. Those are things we have a right to, right? So those are goods. I tend to say goods and services, but we'll think of them as fundamental goods and really defined as social needs, self-preservation, nutrition, shelter, healthcare, education. I know education doesn't seem to be consistent with all, readily to the mind. But look, inequality. There are certain things that enhance that, certain things that exacerbate the inequality. Education is fundamental, because it not only increases your ability to function, read and write, do the basic stuff, but also to think and understand more. That's what college does, or even trades, very important, right? Understanding how to do something allows us to understand things at a much deeper level. And that means we can protect our rights better. So being an informed citizen, going back to the requirement that everyone has to be a sophisticated consumer of political information at some level, education helps with that. First step is to give you the rudimentary, right? You can read, write, do basic things. Then beyond that, to build up an understanding of things in different areas, liberal arts education, or maybe in a particular area, in sciences or the arts or social sciences. Expanding one's awareness, expanding one's awareness is really key. Maximizing human potential, right? Look, example, how many people were born into abject poverty here or elsewhere and didn't have the opportunity to take their abilities, their natural abilities. Some people just, there are people, as I said before, that just get trigonometry, they just get math. It's simple. It makes perfect sense to them. Others, including social scientists, they look at that typically, and it's sort of another language. It's like, whoa, what does that mean, right? It's problematic for them. For some, they can hear melodies in their head, and they can write them out, and they can perform them, and they have musical talent. Others, tone deaf. Can't sing, can't really, they can hear the melody, but they really can't duplicate it, whatever. So we all have different talents, right, in different measures. Education helps bring those out. It helps us explore them, define them, and then use them. And if nothing else, it helps us enjoy others that can to a deeper level, to be able to go and listen to some music and understand the complexities of it and so on, or ideas. The thing that distinguishes human beings from everything else on the planet is our capacity to think. Say what you will about other forms of life having intelligence, and they exist. On Earth here, but I don't see any dolphins on the moon. I don't see dolphins, smart animals, discovering cures for anything. They're smart in certain ways, right? Human beings, through education, it's the way in which we can actually bring about more equality. Human rights are dearly fostered by education. The differences in class, education. If there's one thing that can get you up on a level playing field and have your day on the field, sorry for the sports analogy, it's education. Everyone should have a right to get on the field, whether it's the arts, the science, whatever, sports, and test themselves to know that I can do this, and I do it well, or as much as I love this, it's not for me. So I love sports. I really want to play, basketball. I love basketball. But I'm really not that good at it. I know. I'll go to law school, become a sports agent. I can be involved, but on a different level. Can't do that without education. It's a great equalizer. It's the one thing that we can all grab hold of and advance ourselves with. You want to starve out a population, you can do it not only by taking away food, but by giving them opportunities to understand and learn things. So education is really important. I would argue that, when you take away the fundamentals to becoming educated, you've done a great disservice. So you can go to private schools, and it's no slam on private schools, and you can get all these resources. Also public schools that are special schools, right? And then you can go to other high schools in poor areas, and there's not enough books, there's not enough chairs, there's really not a lot of learning going on because the resources aren't there, and every day, every student is reminded that they're not getting the resources, and that's an affront every day. It's like, I matter less. I matter less than folks in another neighborhood or what have you. And tying, the amount of money, in a sense, schools get by property taxes already is an economic discriminatory, measure, right, of determining who gets what. It's so key. It's so important. Where would we be, all of us, including myself, if the opportunity weren't there to find, things that we may be good at, and to expand our awareness, and to enjoy life more? That should be a right, and the way you do that is through education. Other ways too, but education is so critical to it. All right. So these norms pertain to provisions of goods, meaning economic needs, right? Work, fair wages, that sort of thing, an adequate living standard, Social Security safety net. But all of these things are determined somewhere, and they're determined by the structures we put in place. Think of this. I think Bezos, Amazon, and I may be misstating the numbers, so don't hold me to this, but I think there was one day where Bezos made something like 18 million. I hope it's not billion, but you can check it out in one day. Now, let's just say that may not be true. Let's just do it this way. He made an investment and paid off in one day like that, or had a good day. If you're worth $50 billion and you put it into a 1%, right, savings, so 50 billion into a 1% savings account. Okay, 50 billion. 10% would be 5 billion. So you're making 500 million. I think that's the math. $500 million in a year. Let's even make it simpler. Let's just say it's $52 million in 1 year. That means you're making $1 million every week. Now stop. Think about a person that's working for minimum wage. Let's just keep the number simple. Let's just say it's $20. I know it's not, but let's just say it's 20. They work a 40-hour week. Let's say they get paid for 40 hours, $800 a week, right? That's $3,200 a month. Say they don't pay any taxes, no taxes at all. So they make $3,200 a month. It's 32, it's 38, around 38,000. Let's call it $40,000 a year. No taxes, all for you. In 10 years, right, that'll be 400,000. In 20 years, it'll be 800,000. 20 years, right? In 25 years, you'll hit around that $1 million mark. 25 years of working 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year to make the same amount of money that this example, Bezos, I don't mean to pick on him, made in one day. 8 hours compared to 40 hours a week, right? For 25 years. Now, does Bezos bring that much more to society than that other person does? These are arguments we can have, but the fundamental thing here is that fair wages are important. And we get into all kinds of complicated, things that a lot of people, cognitive dissonance, default to. Well, capitalism is great. Capitalism works that way. There's no system that works in and of itself on sort of without being restrained or limited in some way, that's going to be functional and is going to actually work to anyone's advantage. Capitalism run amok, we talk about capitalism and democracy, is no cure. And human nature fear, pushes that envelope. People want to make more and more money, right? So that socioeconomic elements are really important. They're complicated, just like civil political are. So then the last part, and again, these are things that really you can address to the governing structures. But the collective developmental human rights have two subtypes. The self-determination of peoples, their political status, their economic and social and cultural development, right? That's what we call self-determination, deciding those issues on their own. And certain special rights of ethnic and religious minorities, enjoyment of their own cultures, language, and religion. I want to give an example here of how ideas can change. America was always referred to as a melting pot. That people came from many other places to America. They brought with them their life experiences, their culture, and they keep it for that first generation sort of, together, usually in a city, in a neighborhood, because it feels comfortable, cognitive consistency. I brought my family to America, moved to New York, to Greenpoint, because that's where a lot of people from my culture, my country, my nation go. And there are stores there, and there are people that speak the same language, and they have a similar experience back home. And you can get your ethnic food there. You can get, so the culture feels safe. Makes perfect sense. And it gives the next generation time to be the gap generation, or the bridge generation between what was brought over and feels like home, and the beginning of introducing that to outside the enclave and bring people into it to experience it and to accept it, right? Then there's a third generation, which doesn't necessarily want to live in Greenpoint anymore. Although nowadays, right? They would want to, Greenpoint's like ridiculously expensive. They want to move out someplace else. They love their culture, but it's all of a sudden they find the other interesting. Someone that doesn't come from their culture. Intermarrying happens. Children. So all of that begins to change, usually by third generation. It's not a law, but typically. Some cultures manage to keep that together longer, but at the end of the day, that's not a long distance run. Very difficult to make it a real long distance run. So it was always seen as a good thing. Then we get to a point in time where we talk about cultural appropriation. How do we define that? What are its limits? Why is it important? What constitutes appropriating a culture? I've not heard a good definition of that. It's more of a political sort of perspective that is not filled with a whole lot of substance, as far as I can tell, right? Am I appropriating a culture when I like to wear the clothes that culture wears? I find them attractive. The clothes. Wow, that's really, I would love to wear that. And so I wear it, and someone says, you should be wearing that. Or in my case, if we're going to start going into food and saying that, wanting to cook a certain food or open up a restaurant that cooks that kind of food, even though I'm not from that culture, is that cultural appropriation? Or is that me affirming the culture and saying, I love this food, right? For someone like me, food, different cultures and their food, this is the jackpot. This is the jackpot. Bring it on. More cultures, more food, more things to experience. In terms of that, to me, that is the most important. I realize it's not major, but for me, it's like, wow, I never had Ethiopian food, and this is really good. Or I don't like that dish, but I love this dish, right? And there's certain universalities to it, right? The idea here is that I think every culture has some sort of bread dipped in something sweet, honey, or the like. All the foods I've eaten, you can find that. Different forms, different tastes, but fundamentally the same thing. That says something about all those cultures. So here's a fundamental idea. One point, it's considered embracing that culture and bringing it in and creating an American. Americans are a composite, right? And then it becomes, well, no, you shouldn't be doing certain things. You're appropriating that culture. But is appropriating it appropriate? Is it okay to say, I like that culture? People are drawn to other people. They form relationships, partnerships and marriages and all kinds of things with each other because they're drawn to that person. Or maybe they don't see any differences at all, and it's just that, there's something about that person. I like their sense of humor or whatever. So this cultural appropriation thing is confusing. So when you talk about this collective developmental human rights, about your cultures and your languages, should no one learn another country's language? I'm fascinated when people speak another language because I don't have the capacity for it. Tried, always failed. So my brain doesn't get that. It gets trigonometry, does not get that. So whenever I hear an accent, I'm fascinated because I know that person speaks at least one more language than I do. And I'm tempted, although I know it's going to serve no purpose for me, is to say, how do you do that? How can you doesn't it get confusing? But they can do it. And that's really, really valuable. So if I learn to speak the language, is that a good thing or a bad thing? So you need a real clear definition of what, when you talk about, going ahead and appropriating someone else's culture, what that exactly means. And I've heard different things, but again, it's sort of like human rights. You have to really bear down on it and really be able to explore it more fully. So anyway, religion and the like. In the First Amendment, you have a right to practice your faith, but it's not an unqualified right. And again, like I said last time, the reason for there not being any unqualified right is that eventually that right, the specific right, not the universality of it, but the specific right to do something, has to end where the right of another begins. Otherwise, there's no right at all. It's just we're having at it. So it's important to keep in mind that rights are not unqualified. Human rights, as they're defined, are fundamental and permeate everything. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the manifestation of a specific right built on natural, built on, in the structure of human rights, like speech or worship. So with religion, even though this is, part of the structure, you can't have human sacrifice as part of your faith. I mean, you can have it, but you can't do it. Because ultimately, the very idea, right, the fundamental is self-preservation. So if your religion says we have to sacrifice human beings, that person has a right to self-preserve. Now, what about someone that believes in that faith and is willing to die for it or be sacrificed for it because they believe that that's going to advance them in some way? There again, there's a culture. And should that be permissible? Even though that person's okay with it, are they fully in possession of their faculties? Because self-preservation is pretty well settled. Why don't you want to self-preserve? Because I believe there's another life after this, and that's more important. But if we allow people to go ahead and just exercise that right in that way, there's going to be some that don't fully understand what they're doing. And so it becomes really complicated, right? Some would say it's not complicated at all. But think of it in terms of, someone making a decision that their life, they've got a terminal illness, euthanasia, right? And they realize it's going to get really bad and that's not how they want to live. And so with the help of medicine, they can die a peaceful and planned death so that they don't have to deal with the horrors of that illness as it progresses. Now, we're upset about that. A lot of states, you can't do that. Of course, you can't punish someone that does it, but you can't do that. And certainly you can't have anyone assist them. That's the real problem, someone assisting them. Doctor-assisted suicide and that sort of thing. But yet we can go through the legal process, and if someone is found guilty of committing certain crimes, we can put them to death. You can't die. You don't have the right to say you want to die and take your life. And that's a hard way to express it, but end your life, because where it's going is irreversible, and it's filled with a lot of pain, emotional, psychological, and physical, for you and the people that love you, and you want it to end. But we can take away your life, for violating a law. There are these conflicting ideas that make the whole concept really very fascinating, right? About where these rights based on self-preservation is taking your own life because you're terminally ill. Is that somehow self-preservation? Well, how do you define preservation of what? Just the physical being? The intellectual being? Emotional, or if you believe spiritual being? Psychological being? That's why it's complicated. A few years back, there was a woman, I forget her name now, but she had a type of brain cancer, tumor that couldn't be treated. It's just a matter of time. And she would get these massive, massive headaches and be in incredible pain. And this is going to go on for some time. And she decided that she couldn't do this. She's, her husband and she talked about it, and her mom, who she's close to, discussed it. And she said, I can't. I can't do this. I'm in pain, and the pain is so severe, and it hurts so much that I have no quality of life. And I want to control my death here. I want to die at a time that I've prescribed with the people I love around me, listening to the music I've loved all my life, and just slowly slip away. And they had to move to, I think it's Oregon. I'm sorry, I don't remember which state, but Oregon, Washington State, I'm not sure. But one of them allows, once you've been there, I believe, for a certain period of time, to act, as a citizen in that state, to be able to euthanize yourself. And so she went there, and doctors gave her these pills, one or two, I forget what the pills were, not important, and said, here they are. When you're ready, you take them. And here's what's going to happen to you when you take them. And eventually, she died the way she wanted to die, in her own house, in her own room, with her husband there and her mother, listening to the music she loved, and she slowly drifted away and passed. Why are we disturbed by that? We should be disturbed about certain things. I think a study came out recently that said that young kids, especially during this time of COVID and the like, that take their own lives, make that decision within 5 minutes. Now, if that is true, and I had no way of checking the study, but if that's true, you've got a young kid that doesn't have a developed frontal lobe yet, can't reason their way through it, is isolated, and decides to take their own life. All that potential gone, lost. These are complicated issues. I mean, we can talk about it in sort of this academic way, collective developmental human rights. But these have real implications for how people live their lives and how people manage to make it through those lives in some sort of way that feels, of value. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. There'll be another lecture exploring this further. What I would like you all to do is, this is I know this is a long article. It's 95 pages. But this is an article that really shapes the other articles, give us pieces of this, and sort of I've walked you into the water. Now, these issues are going to get more complicated and more expansive and much more informative. If for no other reason than they cause you to do some mental gymnastics. And there's real value in that. So what I would tell you is I would read this and I would spend time and watching this lecture. I try when I can to read from certain parts so you see what's important and you know that not just for an exam, but to inform, the blocks, right? The piece of this that we're building. It's helpful to know as we walk step by step by step. So that means you should read. It's best if you can't read ahead. My preference for you would be read it all, take whatever notes you'd like, but at least just read it and take some of it in. And then when you listen to the lecture, I move down, from the first page all the way through, highlighting certain things, reading them so you know what I'm talking about, and then expanding on them, put them in a larger context, and integrating the ideas. So it's that part of the lecture that you have to kind of put together. As you're reading these things and highlighting them for yourself, the things that I'm reading to you from it, so you know they're important. Your job is to take the lectures as you listen to them and see how I'm putting it together and think about them in that way, and then think about them in ways beyond the ways I've mentioned. This is an interactive process. You're as much responsible for educating yourself as I am for educating you. You need to engage. And the best way to do that is to read, listen to the lectures, and think about what I'm saying and incorporate what you think. Okay? That's the best way to do this. All right, so that's the end of this lecture. Please try and do as I've said, and we'll continue next time.